It's not enough just to change the constitution. It's not enough just to remove Islam from the constitution and to normalize with Israel and to reintroduce the riba-based banking system. There is an attempt now by UAE and Washington to rebuild the Sudanese state in their image.
How does America get away with this?
Bin Zayed believes that they should not be allowed to choose their rulers themselves. Allah can tolerate kufr with justice but will not tolerate Islam with injustice.
Why is the UAE so hell-bent on working against the ummatic vision of this ummah?
Burhan lives about 2 blocks down from, I'm speaking American now, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.
At a time where our attention is fixed on Gaza, rightly, another conflict is taking place with horrendous cost to human life. Sadly, as always, our ummah has been subject to the political ambitions of egotistical actors and their outside backers. Sudan is burning. There are 8 million people on the move, escaping the indiscriminate murder, rape and pillage of what can only be described as 2 warlords that have thwarted a people's revolution, aided by external powers. So we've had our chocolate break, Sami. Let's talk about Sudan, another really important issue, I think, that's impacting this ummah, and probably an area where I would suggest myself as well, we haven't really been following quite intimately, and I know you have. So it's probably worth starting from the very beginning. So it's suggested that maybe over 10,000 people have been killed in the year crisis that has beset Sudan. I suspect that's a low figure, and there's probably much more. There's around 8 million people who are internal or external refugees who've either fled the country or are moving around the country. There is a contest between 2 army men, General Burhan and General Hamdi. Tell us a bit about these 2 individuals, the current crisis, before we work our way backwards and look at some of the longer term issues that has led to where we are today.
I think that in Sudan, to put it in very simple terms, the aim of the war in Sudan that is led by Hamdi, backed by the UAE and with which Washington enjoys great sympathy for, is a bid to reconstruct the army in Sudan in order to impose ideological changes to the state. By ideological changes to state, what I mean is removing Islam from the constitution, normalizing ties with Israel, re-establishing the riba system, the interest-based economic system in Sudan itself, and to make Sudan much more pliant than it's been in the past. And Hamdi is now fighting a war by proxy on behalf of the UAE and Washington in order to try to reconstruct the Sudanese army. That's in simple terms. The outbreak of the war began when Burhan, the general the head of the Supreme Council who was ruling Sudan, realized that the leftist parties who were part of this transition period were frustrated that they were not being given power by the army or by the military or the like to rule as they wished over an extended transition period, and therefore they had hoped that Hamdi would be able to topple Burhan and then hand over power to them. The reason being is that in 2019, after the revolution, if you want to call it that, there was a concern in UAE and in Washington that if elections were held in Sudan, then the Sudanese would not vote for leftist parties or parties of an ideological leaning that was preferable to Washington or the UAE, but rather they would still vote for Muslim-leaning parties. If they didn't vote for the Islamist of Umar Bashir, they would vote for Islamists of a different party or the like, but that there would still be a very Muslim identity to the Sudanese state. And as a result, there was an agreement with leftist parties and the Communist Party under the banner of Qiwa al-Hurriya wa Taghyir, which is the Forces for Freedom and Change, they call themselves, in which they agreed on a transition period whereby they would be able to conduct constitutional changes of the state without needing to go back to the people. And the reason being, it's important to highlight that Sudan has been under sanction for 30 years, specifically to bring about those ideological changes and to remove the Muslim nature of the state. When you talk about 2019 revolution, there's often a desire to look at it within the context of the Arab Spring. But Sudan is very different from the Arab Spring. Sudan in 2019 was seen as the result of the 30 years of sanctions, which is why when Umar Bashir's government was toppled, the Sudanese people felt they did a revolution, but Washington believed wholeheartedly that Bashir had been toppled as a result of sanctions, that they had squeezed the economy enough to finally force people out onto the streets to topple al-Bashir, and therefore Washington would dictate the terms, not the Sudanese. That it would be Washington who dictate the terms, not the Sudanese, in the way perhaps that the Tunisians had dictated their own transition in Tunisia itself, which is why that the Sudanese were stunned that even after toppling al-Bashir, they could not dictate the terms of the transition agreement.
Why could they not dictate the terms?
The reason they could not dictate the terms was that, in essence, when the Burhan and Hemeti, they toppled Umar al-Bashir. So the story goes that there's a province called Gadaref. Gadaref, the governor, lifted subsidies on oil, on the petrol. So for context, Sudan had the cheapest petrol of all of the Arab world, cheaper even than Saudi Arabia, because it was heavily subsidized. Because as a result of the sanctions, the Bashir government sought to increasingly subsidize the oil to make things easier for the Sudanese people. As a result of the economic squeezing, there was an economic crisis in 2017 whereby there wasn't enough cash in the economic system. So there was money in the banks, but there wasn't enough cash going around. So you'd go to a cash machine and the cash machine would not have enough cash to give you the money that you have in your account itself. So there was a number of economic reforms that were sought to be implemented by the Bashir government. In Gadaref, one of the provinces, they lifted the subsidies on petrol. But even when they lifted the subsidies, it wasn't like a hike in the way, for example, it suddenly became more expensive in Saudi Arabia. It went from like 1 guinea, or like 1 Sudanese pound, to about 5 Sudanese pound. And then there was also lifting the subsidies on bread. And that resulted in an outbreak of protest that took place, and the protest took place in Khartoum itself. When the protest took place in Khartoum, it was unclear what everybody should do. So Omar al-Bashir invites Hemeti of the Rapid Support Forces. The Rapid Support Forces was a force that was set up by Omar al-Bashir to guard the border with Chad and Libya, because Chad and Libya were seen as the supply chains for the Darfur rebels when they would revolt against Khartoum. So he established the RSF in order to keep that border there. He invited Hemeti to provide extra support to try to keep the protests in Khartoum under control. Salah Ghosh, the head of intelligence, Hemeti and Burhan, who was a general in the army, they eventually decided to topple Omar al-Bashir and to seize power for themselves. When they seized power for themselves, they realized very quickly that none of them had the ability to really change anything in Sudan without the support of Washington lifting the restrictions on finances to Sudan itself. And unless Washington would finance Sudan, none of the other nations would come and finance Sudan itself. The Qataris were not willing to put finances in, neither were the UAE, neither was Saudi Arabia, because they wanted to see changes first take place to the state, as with Washington itself. So the Washington believed that given that it was the one that would dictate the terms, they laid out the terms that were necessary. And that's why when they formed the transition government, in the beginning, Burhan and Hemeti, the generals who had toppled al-Bashir, when they entered negotiations with the leftist parties made a series of demands. Amongst their demands were 69% appointed members of parliament. Not elected, appointed. They all agreed there should not be elections. So they agreed 69% appointed members of parliament, a constitutional committee that would be run by them to allow them to make changes to the constitution. And when they started falling out over how to share the power, the UAE came in and broke in an agreement and reminded them that, guys, if you don't agree, elections might actually be held, and elections will ruin all of us. If we let the Sudanese choose, they will not choose you, the leftist parties. You guys won't even get 2-3%. And the generals will be ousted from power as well, because the army elements are already angry that you guys did a coup and you guys took the leadership for yourselves. So they decided to agree in this very awkward transition agreement whereby there would be a Supreme Council. The army would technically rule for 2 years. So Burhan would rule for 2 years, and then he'd hand over power in 2021 to the leftist parties, but there would be a civilian government. That civilian government would rule on its own. Washington was very clear about the ideological change that it wanted in Sudan, which is why very quickly Burhan made a deal with the rebel movements in the north, in which one of the terms was, we will remove Islam from the constitution. The leftist parties, the civilian government, then restored the interest-based banking system in Sudan despite popular protests. Then they normalized ties with the Israelis, despite protests from the Sudanese people, things that could never be achieved democratically. When the 2 years came up in 2021, the Americans and the UAE went for the next stage, which is that given that the army remains very much Islamist, and given that the army is what has resisted the pressure from Washington over the past 30 years to make those ideological changes, in order to rebuild the Sudanese state, it's not enough just to change the constitution. It's not enough just to remove Islam from the constitution and to normalize with Israel and to reintroduce the riba-based banking system. We need to remove that which upholds the Islamic identity of Sudan. I'm not saying Islamic identity in that Sudan is Islamic. I'm saying that Islam being a major role in Sudan.
Political identity.
Political identity. That given the army was the one that resisted us for 30 years under the guise of Umar al-Bashir, albeit I say the army, Umar al-Bashir's final government had 23 parties, part of it as well, including the other parties and the like. We need to restructure the army. So in 2021, after those 2 years where they had embarked on that normalization of ties and removing Islam from the constitution and reintroducing the riba-based economic system and the like, and making concessions to the rebel movements, the next stage was, how do we reconstruct the army? So the UAE from 2019 had been supporting Hemeti and building his RSF, his Rapid Support Forces. So what was supposed to be an auxiliary force ended up a very powerful force. So Hemeti's forces went and fought in Yemen. They went to fight in Libya. They went to fight in other arenas. The UAE training these forces to become like a proper army. And the suggestion was that Washington would agree to the army being dismantled and that the RSF would be the new core on which the army would be built around. Yeah. The reason that part is important is because when the Syrians argue that the Americans want to destroy the Assad regime because it's against Israel, it's a half-truth, but there is some truth to it. And it's the same concept that they apply to Iraq, in that the Israelis identified that the Arab armies are anti-Zionist, and that therefore, as part of normalizing in the region, these armies need to be dismantled and rebuilt. And that's why it was believed that there was a very quick move to punish Iraq. Even though bin Laden had come from Afghanistan to bomb the Twin Towers, it's one of the reasons why Iraq was very quickly seen as an area to attack, dismantle the army and rebuild it in a way that will provide a haven for the Israelis. And also why the US jumped on what was happening in Syria to try to encourage the dismantling of the army in Syria as well. I'm not saying the Syrian army is good or just in any way. I'm saying the American ideal of the new Middle East requires a reorganization of the army itself, which is why in Sudan they also saw it in the same aspect. Because in Sudan what al-Bashir had done was, as a result of the sanctions, he built these huge weapons manufacturing factories, and he was able to build his own weapons afterwards. And Netanyahu is on record as having said to the Americans that Sudan needs to be sanctioned. This is about 96, 97. Sudan needs to be sanctioned because the Palestinians are getting their weapons from Sudan itself. So as a result, they believed the army needed to be reconstructed and dismantled, and with the RSF. In 2021, when it came to the time to hand over power to the civilian, of course, the army said, no, absolutely not, because we know what's happening again. So when the leftist parties found it was very difficult to dismantle the army, that's when they asked Hemeti to go and get rid of Burhan. So there was an agreement, even with some elements of the army, that Hemeti would go and assassinate Burhan, take over power, and then dismantle the army and put the RSF as the new core, and then bring these leftist parties into power, and Washington and the UAE would together embark on these ideological changes to the state that the Americans desired and for which they imposed the 30 years of sanctions for. Burhan lives about 2 blocks down from, I'm speaking American now, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. In any case, two streets down. I make Toba for that. Yes. I speak English. two streets down. Yeah. Hemeti was supposed to assassinate him quickly in the night and then move on. Burhan got a tip off. I think about 30 of Burhan's guards were killed, but Burhan managed to run away. And now there is this war now between the army and between the Rapid Support Forces backed by the UAE. The army made some gains, but then the UAE amplified its support for the RSF. And that's why you see that Washington is very timid in what it says about Sudan, because Washington also believes that the ideological changes it wants to bring to the state is unique to the RSF. Some people might say I'm exaggerating the idea of the ideological changes, but it's important to highlight some context about Sudan.
Yeah.
Sudan, after the British left, what they did was, Sudan is an amalgamation of different areas. So what the British did, they lumped these areas together. Darfur, who are non-Arab tribes, the south, which is where the Christians are, and then the Muslim, Arab, northerners, and that became Sudan. As a result of this amalgamation of different, there's always been fighting and chaos. The south don't want to be part of Sudan. The Darfurians believe they should have their own independent state. And there's always been conflict. And there's always been different nations supporting different factions against the Sudanese. Which is why Sudan has gone through coup after coup after coup after coup after coup. In 1982, John Garang appears from the south, and he leads a rebel movement in the south. The reason why I say 1982 is because 1983 is when Sharia is announced in Sudan. Is to highlight that Garang was not revolting against Sharia or against what's happening in Islam. Garang had already begun his independence movement in the south. In 1983, Namiri announces Sharia. He removes the riba-based banking system and he imposes a law. But 2 years later, Garang is making advances. He's taking different cities and the like. So the military does a coup in Namiri. Suwar al-Dhahab takes over. Suwar al-Dhahab rules for 1 year, then hands over to elections. Sadiq al-Mahdi comes to power. Sadiq al-Mahdi rules for 3 years. But in those 3 years, John Garang in the south, backed by the Americans, has now taken multiple cities and he's besieging Juba, the capital of the south. The army say, listen, this is outrageous. So Sadiq al-Mahdi, you do something or we're going to topple you. The Ba'athists, the Arab nationalists, are planning a coup. The Islamists realize the Ba'athists are going to do the coup on Thursday. They go and do the coup on Wednesday and they go and take power. Throughout that period, the Americans are insistent, and the Christian organizations of America are insistent Sudan needs to be split. It needs to have that south needs to be split, and Darfur also needs to be split. So Darfur received support. You remember throughout the 90s, it was like Darfur, what's happening in Darfur. And the South Sudan eventually in 2005, it secedes from Sudan itself. Bashir eventually turns around and says, listen, we were never technically united anyway. Khalas, just get off my back. The Darfurians are supported by the Americans so much so that they get to Durman in 2008. Durman is in Khartoum, like it's on the outskirts, not outskirts, but just inside Khartoum. They enter Khartoum itself. The reason why I'm mentioning all of this point is that the pressure that was brought on Sudan was wholeheartedly in order to achieve ideological changes. What we're seeing now in Sudan is a bid by the UAE and Washington to finally deliver on the reasons for which those sanctions were imposed in the first place, which is to eliminate the Muslim identity of Sudan and completely reorient its identity in a way that is conducive to allowing the Israelis to be integrated into the region again, because it was from Sudan that the 3 no's were announced. No to normalization, no to occupation, no. It was from Sudan that it was announced, which is why Sudan, when it normalized, the Israelis really celebrated the victory. They said this was the land of the 3 no's, now it's the land of the 3 yeses in terms of normalization or the like. This is not to say that Burhan is defending Islam. Not at all. Yeah. There are intricacies to the dynamics that we can talk about afterwards. Burhan is not defending Islam, but rather what's happening in Sudan is the people are out of the dynamics completely, because for Washington, it was never a popular revolution at top of al-Bashir. For the UAE, it was never a popular revolution at top of al-Bashir. Have you ever seen the UAE and Saudi celebrate a revolution? Have you ever seen the Saudi ambassador celebrate their support? No, because in their perspective, it wasn't a revolution. From their perspective, Sudan was sanctions imposed al-Bashir, a new generation that grew up under sanctions, that saw on Instagram what the world looks like outside of Sudan, and said, we desire more. And instead of blaming the sanctions, they blamed Omar al-Bashir. This is not me defending Omar al-Bashir, but it's to highlight some information about how Omar al-Bashir was able to survive those sanctions. Sudan in 1989 had 3 universities. Today it has 100. Sudan in 1989 had 1 bridge to cross the Nile. It now has more than 8 across different parts of the Nile to cross. Sudan used to have maybe 100 health centers. It now has more than 600. Sudan, in other words, despite those sanctions, Sudan was able to develop that particular infrastructure. Bashir was able to survive those sanctions up to a point where the Americans were finally beginning to talk about lifting those sanctions, and actually at that moment is when the people decided to take to the streets to protest after the lifting of the subsidies, and now the country has been plunged into war, where the fuel went from 1 guinea, to 5. Now it's about 600, 700 guinea for the petrol. It was once cheaper than Saudi Arabia. Now it's through the roof expensive. The point is that it shows you how the al-Bashir government, and with those 23 alliance parties that were with him, that included parties from Darfur, were able to navigate those particular sanctions. But going back to the original point, many people will say that this is a war between 2 warlords, as you did in your introduction. That's true on a superficial level. But at the heart of it, the reason why there is war in Sudan is because there is an attempt now by UAE and Washington to rebuild the Sudanese state in their image. And that image is one in which there is no Islam. And that's why the army is resisting the dismantling, not necessarily maybe perhaps it wants to protect the state, but it knows that as soon as that army is dismantled, we enter a situation like Iraq, which enters chaos, and we also enter a situation where Washington steamrolls those ideological changes. And the interesting thing is this, that Washington is making its financing of Sudan conditional on the ideological changes, which is why you have none of the parties talking about elections. The Hemeti and the leftist civilian parties that they talk about, led by Hamdok, who was their prime minister. The civilian parties are adamantly against elections because they know the Sudanese tendencies are not aligned with them. Sudanese people, of course, rightly lambast the al-Bashir government over the past 30 years, that it didn't produce what it was supposed to produce. That's 100% true. The point I'm making here is not that al-Bashir was good or the like. The point I'm making here is that while the Sudanese people are trying to push for their freedom and agency to choose their own rulers, Washington and the UAE believe them to be outside the dynamics because there are ideological goals that they are seeking to achieve. And this is why, despite the genocide that Hemeti is committing in Darfur, the Americans, who were the loudest in support of Darfur during the 1990s and 2000s, are silent about what's happening in Darfur because they believe that the genocide, they're willing to turn a blind eye to it if it means that Hemeti can be allowed to dismantle this army that refuses to impose the ideological changes that Washington is after.
So I've got 2 questions. Let's start with question 1, the American motive. So the American motive, your argument is it's ideological and it's trying to subvert not just the popular revolution democracy in Sudan, but also subvert the Islamic character of the state. And that seems to be where you're going here. Hamdi is the vehicle to do that in order to erode the power structures within the army and replace it with a far more secular leftist movement. So that seems pretty clear. I suppose the question really is, how does America get away with this? I mean, from a superficial perspective, the Americans talk a lot about human rights and they talk about democracy. And of course, Biden in particular, he's the guy who convened two or three democracy conferences around the world. And, he's on record talking about how his administration is a bulwark against Russian and Chinese authoritarianism. This may be a very simplistic question in many ways, but how does the American administration get away with so obviously backing a force that is trying to thwart that groundswell civilian movement?
Put yourself in the Zionist position. The Zionists, in the history of the creation of the Israeli state, were invaded by Arab nations when they first announced their state.
Yeah.
And then they had the 6-Day War. And then they had the war over Sinai that took place as well. The Zionists believe that the armies of the Arab nations are anti-Zionist and that are committed to the destruction of Israel because they believe, rightly so, that Israel stole the land of the Palestinians and it's colonizing the Palestinian lands. The conclusion of the Zionists after those wars was that the armies need to be dismantled. The Arab armies need to be restructured. They need to be dismantled. The reason I say this is that Biden pursues it from the framework of peace, that to achieve peace in the region, these armies need to be retrained and they need to be retaught, which is why America spends a lot on the armies in terms of providing them military aid and the like, to retrain the armies into a way that lets them abandon those anti-Zionist tendencies in order to try to come up with a new army that is more amenable to integration. Why? Because these countries are not democracies. Yeah. These countries are ruled by military rule, and therefore if we can make sure the military are pro-Zionist, then therefore Israel will be able to be successfully integrated into the state. And as Robert Kennedy suggested, Israel is the US outpost through which the US is able to maintain a foothold in that jungle that is the Middle East. His words, not mine. The point being is that Biden justifies it from the idea of peace. That at the end of the day, Omar Bashir ruled for 30 years and it was considered a military dictatorship. Biden argues. I always say that Sudan sometimes is a bit more nuanced. Al-Bashir was able to bring in many parties into his government. I'm not saying he was ideal or perfect. I'm not saying there were free and fair elections. I'm saying that there was at least consensus governments on multiple occasions, to the extent that even Jibril Ibrahim from Darfur, a non-Arab who's now finance minister under this new government, Jibril Ibrahim, who was leading the forces that reached Durman in 2008, he led the forces from Darfur, almost took the capital Khartoum. Jibril Ibrahim himself entered into a government, him and Minim Nawi and all these other people, they entered the government with Omar Bashir afterwards, and they were able to establish a peace agreement with al-Bashir and enter his government and also to rule with al-Bashir itself. The point is that the US argues that in order to achieve peace, we need to restructure these armies, and while the process may be difficult and turbulent, it is a very necessary process in order to do so. And that's why, while he convenes these structures of democracy, Biden's definition of democracy is one in which much more leftist, anti-religion, one in which Islam does not dominate. And we saw that even in the Arab Spring, in that when the Islamists, they won, and I'm not saying the Islamists were the ideal representation of what Muslim politics looks like, but certainly when the people demonstrated an affinity for Muslim-leaning parties,
Tunisia, Egypt.
In the words of Macron in 2020 in the Le Grand Continent magazine, he said that when the Arab Spring elections took place, we realized that Arab populations have an affinity for regression. In other words, that they voted wrongly, basically. It shows that the Americans believe that in their democracy, there's no room for the Islamists, there's no room for these religious-leaning parties. And therefore, in their perspective, to pursue this democracy in Sudan, if that's what they're pursuing in Sudan, to pursue this democracy in Sudan requires these ideological changes to the state. But I think that in Sudan, more specifically, it's more to do with how do you integrate Israel into the region. The Iraqi army is now destroyed.
Yeah.
Assad is now out of, the Syrian army is now out of action as a result of Assad. I'm not saying it's as a result of Assad. You look at the Saudi Crown Prince, Vision 2030, moving away from all that. The Egyptian army is placid. It's not doing anything in terms of... And now you have the Sudan as well, where you have the ability now to reconstruct the army itself through Hamdani, who's supported by the UAE itself. So it's not about whether the US justifies it or not. It's that the US has very carefully constructed a sanctions campaign that had lasted for 30 years that is now bearing fruit from its perspective. And now it's trying to allow room through which it believes this turbulent process will lead to a transition period whereby they can socially engineer Sudanese society to abandon the role of Islam in politics and social life and accept a new form of secular civil rule that will help to contribute to the integration of Israel into the region in a way that the Sudanese were adamantly against before, to the extent that al-Bashir in 2019 even refused to allow an Israeli plane to cross over Sudanese airspace to go towards Kenya itself.
Let's talk about the UAE, because there seems to be a common theme here when we talk about the Muslim world, and we've highlighted the nefarious role of Saudi Arabia in the region and Iran in the region. Maybe we don't give enough time to discuss in the UAE. I mean, it seems that the UAE is far more purposeful than, say, Saudi Arabia, and far more strategic in a nefarious and horrible way than the Saudis are. I'm not sure if you agree or disagree with that, but why is the UAE so hell-bent on working against, if we were to call it the ummatic approach to this ummah or vision of this ummah? Why are they so hell-bent on destroying any form of Islamic movements in the Muslim world?
I think there is the short answer and there is a complex answer. I think for the UAE, I think the Arab Spring was a huge wake-up call. I think the UAE was stunned that the Arab Spring had spread so fast, that the people demonstrated they had agency, that authoritarianism was unable to subdue the people, and that the people still had an affinity for some sort of Islamic rule, and that this wave was spreading super fast and had the potential to topple the monarchies. And therefore, there is a need now to re-educate the Muslim populations. There is a need now to demonstrate that what the people want is not freedom and dignity. What they want is economic prosperity. And I can produce that in a name other than Islam. In the New York Times article, the dark vision of the Middle East prince or something, or the dark prince of the Middle East. In any case, he says it's said in it that Bin Zayed tells Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and says to him that these are a people. He tells him in 2013. He tells him this. The article's in 2020, but he tells him in 2013. He says these are a people who believe that a 1400-year-old book should be a constitution. Are these the kind of people you want to choose their leaders? And it resonates deeply. I think Macron's statement that the people chose regressively, I think it's a statement he heard as opposed to a statement that he came up with himself through his communication close ties with the UAE itself. I think that in the context of Sudan itself, I think that its involvement in Sudan has more to do with being proactive instead of reactive. No, they reacted to the Arab Spring. They're now being proactive in Sudan in terms of constructing what's happening. And the reason why I say it is that Sudanese themselves, in terms of internal dynamics, were actually able to come to some sort of agreements and negotiations between themselves. John Garang, who led the South Sudan rebellion, in 2005, he agreed to be the vice president of Omar al-Bashir as part of the peace agreements. In other words, they were able to come together and agree. Jibril Ibrahim entered, after leading the revolt against Khartoum, entered al-Bashir's government afterwards. They held the peace agreement together and they agreed with each other and they established a semi-autonomous region. Al-Bashir had a knack for coming up with these agreements in between. And I think that the Sudanese sensitivity to foreign intervention was clear when the Saudi ambassador, after the toppling of al-Bashir, said, but for Saudi Arabia, al-Bashir would not have been toppled. And he got a backlash from the Saudis, from the Sudanese people. Yasser Arman, one of the prominent, leftist communist rebels, who armed rebels, he was lambasted by Sudanese. They said, you keep talking about, why are we allowing the UAE to interfere? And he said, there's nothing wrong with seeking foreign help to defeat the Islamists and to remove these Islamic influences from politics. He doesn't dare say to remove Islam from Sudan, but to remove the Islamic influences from politics itself. I think the UAE is trying to be proactive primarily because Sudan is a large country with a large coast on the Red Coast, with a large on the Red Sea. The UAE believes that now is the time to be proactive in order to ensure that the population is re-educated in a way that ensures that they do not embark on revolutions that will affect the established norm of the system. The UAE believes that Ben Ali's problem was not that he was aggressive in his human rights violations in Tunisia, but that he didn't produce a Dubai or Abu Dhabi. UAE says, look at my country. They don't have rights to talk about politics, but they go in the morning to work and they have entertainment in the evening. That's what people want. That's the vision that the UAE pushes. And that's why I think the UAE has become very proactive in this regard, because it believes that it's pushing back against an existential threat, which is a people that believe that they should choose their rulers, whereas Bin Zayed believes that they should not be allowed to choose their rulers themselves. And that's why the UAE has been the prime broker in Sudan. The Sudanese, when they came to the transition agreement, they weren't all in agreement as to who should rule. The way the UAE has been able to maintain that transition is by telling the Sudanese parties that if you fail to agree between yourselves, there will be elections and you will all lose. And they all panic and say, we don't want Sudanese to choose. We don't want Sudanese to choose. And they come together and they form a government once more. I think that the reason that the war broke out despite the UAE mediating is because when it came to the issue of dismantling the army, the UAE believed has been preparing for it for 5 years. It's been preparing it by supporting Hemeti. It's been preparing it by training his forces. There was the Wall Street Journal article which showed that the UAE was sending 30 planes a week through Uganda to the border with Chad to deliver weapons and arms to Hemeti. When Hemeti was still struggling to take Niala in the west, the UAE upped that to 50 planes a week. So it was 30 planes in August and September, then 50 planes in October and November a week going via Uganda to the border with Chad. The Chad president visited the UAE 3 times during this war. Each time the Chad president visits, Hemeti manages to gain some sort of momentum on the field. And that's why Chad was criticized publicly as being the means through which weapons are being supplied to Hemeti. And Chad has a history of facilitating the arms flow to West Sudan. Hemeti believes, or the UAE believes, that there are 2 potential scenarios they can achieve in Sudan. Either Hemeti topples the army in Khartoum and takes Khartoum. They took Khartoum by surprise. The army didn't see it coming, but now it seems the army, according to reports, are now retaking large sections of Khartoum. But the UAE believes that either Hemeti topples Burhan or Hemeti can set up an alternative government in the west, in the second largest city called Niala. Niala is where Darfur is. It's where the non-Arabs are. The problem with the second plan of the UAE is that Darfur, because they are non-Arabs, Hemeti and the RSF are notorious because they're accused of being racist and committing genocide against those local populations.
He led the Janjaweed militias.
He led the Janjaweed militias. And that's why, in order to impose himself in Darfur, Hemeti has had to really go and crack down on the population. There have been videos of corpses on the streets.
Some say 10,000 people just in that region alone. I don't know how true that is.
It's considered a genocide by all means.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, why aren't the Darfurian groups joining the fight against Hemeti? Because if you look, for those who don't know, in Sudan, there are 2 Darfurian giants, I call them, Minni Minnawi and Jibril Ibrahim. Jibril Ibrahim is the current finance minister in the government, standing with Burhan, standing with the army. Minni Minnawi has this big army group, tribal group that he has. But Minni Minnawi announced, I'm neutral in this conflict, and didn't really enter too much. A couple of times he's gone and met Burhan, suggesting he's more amenable towards the army. And one of the concessions it's been said is that, for those who don't know the map of Sudan, you have Niala, you have the western part, but there's also a place called Fashir, which is where Minni Minnawi and these guys are really concentrated. The idea being that the UAE is trying to convince Minni Minnawi that let Hemeti take Niala, let him control those areas, and I promise he won't come near Fashir or your sphere of influence, and you guys can stay there, and we'll bring you as part of the negotiations that are taking place in and of themselves. The UAE believes the second scenario it can achieve is similar to the Libya scenario, where Haftar in 2019 went after Tripoli, the capital. He crossed all of Libya. He conquered the east and then he marched rapidly Tarhuna, then past Tarhuna, then he entered Tripoli. He laid siege to Tripoli, and Trump said to him, look, bluntly, John Bolton said it, might not have said it, but it was implied. I think it was Ghassan Salama, the UN envoy, gave an interview where he said the US, it's as if it gave a green light to the offensive. Haftar laid siege to Tripoli and has an opportunity to take Tripoli and seize Libya. Of course, he fails because of the Turkish intervention. But the backup plan was that if he can't take Tripoli, we split the country in 2 and we set up a capital in the east, which is Benghazi, where Haftar rules. Hemeti tried to take Niala 2 times. The first time, there's a famous video of a general who actually died in the battle, where he says, listen, we either win the battle or we die here. They managed to push back Hemeti's forces, and then the general died. But then the Hemeti later on went in again, and the suggestions are he's taken Niala. The belief is that the UAE will say, if Hemeti can't take Khartoum, he will set up an alternative capital in that western area, in Niala itself. The UAE believes that Sudan, if it can't restructure the army, it can paralyze the army by splitting Sudan even further. And the reason they talk about splitting Sudan is to go back to the original point, which is the British put artificially Sudan together in this idea of Darfur and South Sudan. I remember Sami Hamdi, Allah yarahmu, who was the finance minister. I remember he said once in an interview, he said, people say that Sudan split between North and South, but I argue they were never united in the first place, that the South was never really with us. The point here being is, you ask him, what do the UAE want? The UAE wants to determine the trajectory that Sudan is going in, to ensure that it does not produce a result similar to the Arab Spring, where you have a Muslim-leaning Orient, whereby it suddenly inspires other populations to be free to choose their leaders, to choose Muslim-leaning parties who will influence UAE population and threaten the UAE monarchies. The UAE wants to make sure that it's able to dictate that trajectory, and it's found resonance in Washington because its message is clear. If we allow elections, Muslim party wins. Do you want that? Washington says no. If we allow elections, the Sunnis will not choose the way you want. We need time to train them. Do you agree with me? Yes. We need an extended transition period. Yes. We need to make unilateral changes to the constitution. Yes. And Washington agrees with all of that, which is why you see Washington very loud on Ukraine, Washington very loud on Belarus, Washington very loud on these issues, but very timid when it comes to Sudan.
Exactly. I think that explains the situation very